Morning. Good to be with everybody. My name is Michael Kelley. This is my friend John Hancock.
No, hardly. I want to notice that I was here on time. I'm
2 minutes
late for the radio show.
He is 2 minutes late.
But then when you're debating John, it doesn't need much prep.
So we're glad to be with you. I thought what we'd do this morning is tell you a little teeny bit about us, how we met, and go through the elections. These are very significant elections. I think both of us agree that this has the capacity of being a generational election in America. But we'll talk about the national aspect of the elections as well as deal with some of the races here in Missouri. I want to give a shout out to Martha J. West, who I've known for over 30 years, who I haven't seen in over a decade. Martha, welcome this morning. Everybody say hi to Martha J. West. All right. So Michael and I we graduated from UMSL together about 12 years apart.
Yes, sir.
Didn't know each other at all. And the first time I met Michael Kelley, I was giving a news conference in Jefferson City outside the offices of the Missouri Republican Party, blasting the Democrats for, who knows what. It could have been anything. And Michael Kelley showed up and crashed my press conference. And that's the first time we ever met. And a month or so later, I crashed his press conference.
Yeah, you returned the favor. And then we were honored by UMSL as Alumni of the Year, which is kind of silly if you think about it, that somebody would honor us. But we were honored together and wound up starting this program on KMOX. We're called in before the 2008 election to come in and talk about opposing sides of what we thought was going to happen. We did it for better part of 3 months. We were on every Friday, and since then we've become regular fill-ins of the, I like to call it the Kelley and Hancock show. I think he calls it the Hancock and Kelley show.
That's right. That's exactly right. And we've been doing that now for, years. And Michael Kelley, we disagree on just about everything. He is, however, one of my dearest, closest friends. I love the guy. And I think some of that helps our program be more entertaining than confrontational, but we do disagree, and I reckon we're going to do that this morning.
Yeah, and that's the truth. John and I are friends, and a lot of people in this particular political climate that we live in can't believe that we get along the way that we do. But the reality is while John thinks completely wrong, he is a great person who truly believes that he's pushing for the right things, and we've become lifelong friends, and we try to portray that on KMOX because I personally am sick of hearing people red-faced and yelling at each other on television shows, and it's not what he and I want to do, and so we disagree, usually laugh and move on and know that the other one's wrong. There
you go. And Michael, I will start off with my analysis. Let me point out to you, however, Michael, that we're sitting today in a free market think tank. Now, the free market, Michael,
yes, sir,
is supposed to be that which governs our economy. That is what happens when you unleash the spirit of entrepreneurism and allow people to have access to the greatest, freest, most open nation in the world. And free markets are under assault. And one of the great things about the Show Me Institute is that they stand and wave the banner of the free enterprise system, not in a partisan direction, but in the manner of free enterprise. And that is what I believe is at the core.
Well, and I appreciate what the Show Me Institute does, particularly as it relates to TIF, because a lot of times when people talk about free markets, they think they're talking about handouts to regular voters, or as Mitt Romney would say, the 47%. I would say that the handouts that are also ridiculous are the hundreds of millions of dollars that our communities are handing out to some of the world's largest corporations, supporters of, you, in this process. But the Show Me Institute has always stood firm in opposing that, and I'm grateful for it and appreciate the work they do, despite the fact I may not agree with everything that they push for.
There you go. So let's start at the top, shall we? The presidential election is just around the corner. The most recent polling data that has come out on how this thing is shaping up would seem to indicate that President Barack Obama may have a slight edge. There's some data that came out, I heard just this morning, showing that Virginia has a widening gap for Obama. Ohio looks like Obama has a slight lead. Florida is dead tied. Colorado, as of this morning, is dead tied. And Wisconsin, which was a state that we had hoped was emerging for Republicans with the selection of Paul Ryan apparently has about a 6-point gap in Obama's favor. I am concerned about those numbers, but I am not resigned to accept defeat. I do believe this election is going to be about the fundamental role of government and whether or not we as a society want a government that is going to inject itself ever more into the free enterprise system, and whether we want a government that is going to play the lead role in directing the economic affairs of America. I do not believe a majority of Americans want that. And I believe that when Mitt Romney is on message and when he is talking about the proper role of government, when he is talking about his ability to recognize the economic trouble in the country and create jobs. This nation has a structural unemployment that we haven't seen since the 1930s, now going on 4 years. And I think as that message continues to get out and percolate, come on in everybody, there's plenty of seats available up front, I believe he's gonna prevail. The state of Missouri, as it relates to the presidential race, is pretty much conceded that it's going to go for Mitt Romney. Those 10 electoral votes in our state look like the Romney-Ryan ticket are going to win here. I think it's going to be a very close election. I think it's going to be an extremely important election for the future of the country, and I predict that Romney-Ryan are going to win. And I do think those states that are on the bubble right now are gonna come our way.
That was nice political spin. I don't see it that way. And first of all, there's a big if there when John says when Mitt Romney stays on message. Well, we haven't seen that in clearly a month. This has been the amateur hour that we've seen for the last 2 weeks, the way that Governor Romney has gone about this campaign, and I think he's got himself in a predicament that's going to be tough. We will agree that Missouri is conceded to the Republicans, and I don't anticipate Barack Obama. There's a theory that some say it'll be closer than we think, but I'm not sure if Barack Obama couldn't have won Missouri in 2008, he surely can't do it in 2012. I have a different take. I think people make their decision undecided, and I don't know how you can be undecided if you've got a pulse and you're living. You clearly have a thought as to some feeling one way or the other. But I think people make a decision on who do you like, who do you trust. And when you look at those numbers and polling, Mitt Romney's got a huge gap to deal with. And I think a lot of the narrative and conversation of this campaign as it targets those independents. Now, I know that we think of independents here in Missouri, but this election is likely going to be decided in about 4 or 5 suburbs in the country. Columbus, Ohio, Cleveland, Ohio, parts of Florida. Those independent voters are middle-aged, 40s to 50s, likely to be female. And if you listen to a lot of the rhetoric and the talk that's happened in this election, I don't think that stacks up well for Mitt Romney. I think that the president is ahead right now and is likely to hold that, and Mitt Romney is going to be running from behind. What's crazy is, and I know I'm being recorded, so you can go ahead and pass this around, is this president is not in a position to win this election. He really shouldn't. If you look at all of the numbers that have happened, he's in a place that he should be beat. But a lot of the rhetoric and a lot of the conversation's not really sticking to this president. And it's interesting to see how that's taking place. It's almost like the election's being given to him. I liken it to, I lived through this, for those of you who are from the right side of the aisle. In 2004, there's no reason that George Bush should have been reelected as president if you looked at the numbers and watched the polling and saw where people were. Democrats had such a disdain and hatred for George Bush that we would nominate, well, John Kerry. And as a result, we reaped the consequences of what would happen. And I think we're seeing the same thing in this Republican, in this now general election, what was the Republican primary, that there's a lot of dislike for the president, but not necessarily being able to make the case on what their changes will be, and then it not resonating with those independent voters. I said this last night. John and I have a little road show where we run around and do this. I think one of the things that you'll be hearing the president say a lot in the next, 49 days now, is compromise. And I know a lot of you will chuckle at that. But I think that's a message that this president necessarily didn't really do in his first 2 years when he had supermajorities and it's something he has to speak to now and make that case. I think Mitt Romney, who's run a far-right election, who's now trying to come back to the middle, at the same time has to make that same type of argument. If you listen to people, they're frustrated with us not getting anything done. They want something done. And I think this 2013 period is something that we could potentially see some of these folks coming to the table, much like Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill did back then. Remember him, St. Reagan?
Yeah, I do.
Okay. So that's my thoughts on what will happen in the presidential election.
So how close is it going to be?
I think he'll win pretty handily. I think he's going to win 5 of the 7 states, battleground states.
Michael Kelley predicting a landslide electoral victory for President Barack Obama. That is just wrong. All right, let's get a little closer to home, shall we?
I love this one.
Yeah, I know you do. I'll let you go first. The U.S. Senate race in Missouri started off this cycle. Claire McCaskill, the most vulnerable Democrat incumbent senator in America. She was at the top of everyone's list of Democrats that would be defeated to be part of the equation to give Republicans their first majority in the U.S. Senate since 2006. Michael, how do you see that?
Same case. If you look at the numbers and watch the way that this election's gone down, Senator McCaskill should not win this election.
Correct.
Thank you. She's going to. And she's going to win it based on some of the strategy that I almost said strategery.
Yeah,
it was
strategery.
The strategy that she implemented, and I'm sure you all saw it. She ran several commercials talking about Todd Akin being too conservative for Missouri, and it wound up helping Todd Akin get reelected. We didn't want to face John Brunner. He was the candidate who scared us the most. After that, we would have less likely like to have faced Sarah Steelman because she's a female and she can make that case. The person we wanted to face was the man we got, and then he's got an extremist record. He's always been elected by a very small portion of the electorate. We've seen it again, and we knew that one, we would be able to run against his record, and we knew he had the capacity to accomplish what he did nearly 1 week after the primary, where he not only made himself persona non grata with most voters, but with the Republican Party and those that were going to finance. So I think Todd Akin will sadly be going the same way that Mitt Romney is, but I think he has nobody to blame but himself and Claire McCaskill.
Well, in full disclosure, I've worked on John Brunner's campaign pretty closely in the primary season. One of the reasons I hope this radio gig works out, Michael, is that I think I need to quit running campaigns.
No, we've got another one for you in 2 years.
Yeah, I know you do. But it's going to be very difficult at this point for us to defeat Claire McCaskill. Now, I will say this. The Republican National Committee, the Republican Senatorial Committee, and American Crossroads, the independent expenditure arm that Karl Rove runs, have in fact pulled their money out of Missouri. You all know that; it's no surprise, and they've said that they're not coming back. Now, I would say this as a harbinger of hope on the Republican side. If you look what's happening nationally in Senate races, whether it's in Florida, where our candidate is not performing as well as we'd hoped, Connie Mack down there. If you look at the numbers in Ohio, Josh Mandel is not exactly catching fire against Sherrod Brown in Ohio. Republicans have taken some of the money that they were going to spend in Missouri. They've deployed it up into Maine, where Angus King, the former governor, is running as an independent and is ahead in the polls right now. He would caucus with the Democrats. It does look like we've got a legitimate shot in Wisconsin to pick up Herb Kohl's seat up there with Tommy Boom Boom Thompson, the former governor, the former secretary of HHS. I would say this about Missouri. Todd Akin right now, if you look at the polling data, not the partisan polling data that McCaskill's people put out or that the folks out of the Family Research Council have put out, that's really not accurate polls, neither of them. The real polls in that race have Akin down anywhere from 5 to 7 points right now. come September the 25th, when the deadline for him to withdraw expires, Todd Akin is the Republican candidate for the U.S. Senate. When that deadline expires, McCaskill's going to unleash a flurry of negative ads. She's got a substantial cash advantage, and the Democrats are still playing here very actively. And I would say that if Akin withstands that initial barrage of negative ads and holds up in the polling, and he's within, the middling single digits down, I will predict this morning that it may not come through the Senatorial Committee, it may not come through American Crossroads, but I do believe there will be Republican money spent. If this is one of the seats 3 weeks from now that is in the top tier of giving the Republicans a majority in the Senate, that money will be back. And I question whether Claire McCaskill, whose numbers have been anemic almost since the day she got elected. In the early days, people forget, in the early days of the Obama presidency, he had a 72% job approval rating in Missouri. Claire McCaskill never got above 48. Never in all of that time. And she's not been anywhere near, well, I think she might be near 50 now. But until now. And I don't know that Claire McCaskill has the regard among the electorate in Missouri to be able to build a really substantial lead, even with a money advantage and even with a weakened opponent. If she cannot, then the money will be back. If, however, they unleash those attacks on Akin the first, and starting really a week from today, probably, and she is able to drive a 10, 11, 12, 13-point gap, then the race is over. And so that's my honest assessment of it.
Which then leads us to my second favorite topic, which is the governor's race in the state of Missouri. We, of course, have the most popular Democratic governor in the entire country. He is going to be impossible for David Spence to beat. He's got quite a bit of resources. He's got cross-party support. And I don't see David Spence, despite the planets lining up right and the stars going the right way, being able to pull this off. And just to summarize, I think the governor wins, and he takes most of all of the statewides with him, because he will win by 6, 7, 8 points over David Spence. And I think that's a hard thing for Peter Kinder to try to reverse as the second person on that ballot. So I will predict right now that this is going to look like a lot like 1992 for the Democrats, and that the governor on down will all go Democrat statewide.
I was on that 1992 ticket, Michael.
How'd that work out?
I remember 1992 very well. 1992 was not a friend of mine.
No.
This is not 1992. The governor's race is actually interesting. I think there is, if we assume that Mitt Romney carries Missouri, I believe he will. And I think if we were actually having to put our 401ks on the table and bet on the Senate race, we'd probably have to say that McCaskill's got an edge there. But do you have a 401k?
I do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, how's it doing?
Well, it got killed about 4 years ago in the market.
Yeah. Not recovered much, has it?
No, it hasn't.
So anyway,
It hasn't gotten worse.
But I digress. The governor's race, Jay Nixon is indeed popular in the sense of his job approval numbers. His job approval numbers are very high, and they are very high for a Democrat governor in the country. He may be the highest.
He is.
Yeah. However, the polling data that I've seen, his approval is not a deep approval. Jay Nixon is not a beloved figure in the state of Missouri, and and I think if you really examine his accomplishments, and once those 35 seconds have passed, then you'll realize that he hasn't really accomplished very much. And Dave Spence comes from outside the political system. He is a business person. It's a message that John Brunner tried to carry in the primary for the U.S. Senate. I believe it's a compelling message. Maybe it's not as compelling as I thought it was, but I think that a candidate like Dave Spence, who comes from a private sector background, who can talk credibly about job creation and economic growth, who can point to the numbers that show Missouri's economy is not very good. The St. Louis region isn't creating jobs. The St. Louis region isn't part of that trend-setting. There are some Midwestern cities that are doing enormously better than St. Louis is doing in terms of economic growth. You look at Indianapolis. There's a number of them. St. Louis's economy, the state's economy, are stagnant, and we don't see a lot of growth. I think if Spence can point to the problems that this state faces economically and can pin that tail on Jay Nixon's donkey, then I think he's actually got a fighting shot. Usually, the governor's race in Missouri tracks with the presidential race. Now, that didn't happen in 2008, and that was an anomaly. But if you go back over the course of the last 50 years, I think there's only been 2 or 3 instances where the president went to one party and the governor went to the other. So if Romney wins the state, if Aiken can keep this thing close, I think Dave Spence has a legitimate shot at the governor's.
Perfect word. Legitimate. Perfect word.
Thank you. And on the statewide, there's going to be basically there's 2 dynamics. It's too early to tell right now. Either the Senate race here is the political equivalent of Mrs. O'Leary's cow, where the can's been kicked over and the whole city's burning. That could be. It's too early to say. If that's the case, if you've ever been to Chicago, the water tower that stands right there on Michigan Avenue, it survived the fire. And I think it is extremely likely in a culturally conservative, right of center, red state. I think it's extremely likely that somebody or some bodies on the down ballot statewide are going to survive the fire. And if I had to rank them, I would say just based on who they are and their opponent and their opponent's name identification, I see Scholler, Kinder, Martin, McNary, all having legitimate shots to win and be that water tower. If we're not dealing with Mrs. O'Leary's cow, then I think it's entirely likely that several of these Republicans down ballot can win in November. Remember, this is a state that is no longer, it doesn't knee-jerk Democrat anymore. It used to. It hasn't changed culturally. Missouri's still the same place it always was, but the partisan affiliations have changed. So that people, when you go to southeast Missouri, north Missouri, people that voted Democrat generation after generation after generation, their ideology hasn't changed, but their party affiliation has. And it is now not just a culturally conservative state, but it's a Republican state. And because of that, I think we've got a pretty good shot down the ballot.
So John and I have a steak dinner wager on this election, and I want to bet you on all those other ones, but I don't know if I can eat that much food.
Yeah, you can.
I'm trying to lose weight.
No, you can do it, buddy.
I think that's kind of where it's at.
U.S. Senate, what happens?
McCaskill. No, it stays Democrat by seat. This seat right here.
51-49?
Mm-hmm. You?
I think we get to 50-50, and Vice President Ryan breaks the tie. U.S. House?
I think it pretty much stays the way it is.
Yeah, I think, given redistricting, I think the Democrats likely will gain a handful of seats in the U.S. House. I don't think the majority is
Who's Speaker?
John Boehner, 75%. 25% Eric Cantor. So
could be interesting to watch that.
So that's what we think. We'd love to answer any questions you might have about what's going on out there, or if you want to look retrospectively, we can answer that. If you want to look prospectively, we'll do the best we can. So
you guys did marvelously. Thank you very much. We're not done yet. We want to do some Q&A here. I've been asked. I'm Rick Evelyn. I'm the communications director here at the Show Me Institute. I have been asked to say, no speeches, please, just questions. I do have a question. I'd like to kick it off. We are being inundated these days with poll numbers. You can't go on the internet anywhere, anytime without getting the latest poll. You guys have tons of experience in this area. How do we, as regular people, know which polls are more valid than others?
Go ahead, pollster.
All right. What's happened with polling is very interesting. In the old days, people had phones. You're sitting right there on the kitchen table or on the wall in the kitchen, and if you wanted to get a random sample, you got everybody's phone number, and you called every nth person, and you interviewed them, and scientifically that gave you a good random sample. Those days are gone. So there is not a poll that you see published today that hasn't been weighted or doctored in some way by the pollster. Every pollster does it. Some of them do it from a point of view where they want to produce a certain outcome. Others of them try to do it from an academic point of view where they try and weight the numbers based on known demographic attributes of the area they're sampling. The cell phone explosion is also complicated. So there's not a poll published that hasn't been doctored by somebody. The things that I look at in determining a valid poll, if you see a poll in Missouri, for example, where there is a massive partisan advantage on the people identifying themselves as Democrats and Republicans, if that's outside of 2 or 3 or 4%, okay, in any direction, then you've got a skewed survey there. The way you skew survey, there's 3 basic ways to skew surveys. You can alter the partisan balance so that you get a result that looks differently than the real the real geography. So that's one way to skew it. The other way to skew it is to skew the geographic weighting, so that if you weight too much, Missouri is pretty easy, right? If you weight it up in the urban areas, it's going to look better for a Democrat. If you weight it up in the rural areas, it's going to look better for Republicans. So you want to look at the geographic distribution of the sample. That's the second way that they'll weight the surveys. And then the third way, it's not even so much the questions that are asked, but you want to make sure that when they represent something as a ballot test, they've asked somebody that they haven't preceded that with a lot of information about the candidates that the poll is giving them, as opposed to the voters' initial response. A proper poll ought to ask the ballot questions first before you get into all of the other, did you know that Michael Kelley, let me tell you about that guy. Now, if the election were held today, would you vote for him? Of course not. So those are the things I look at. The Gallup nationally does a pretty fair job. I trust their numbers. I actually think Rasmussen has proven himself over years to be a pretty accurate pollster. I generally do not trust PPP polls, and I generally don't trust polls that come out of. I trust candidate polls more than I trust anything else.
Why is that?
Because a candidate doesn't have any interest in skewing numbers. They want to know exactly where things are, what the reality is, and if the campaign releases numbers and actually releases them, I put a great deal of credence to that.
The PPP and the survey USAs that we see a lot, they're complete nonsense. They have no way of knowing who answered that phone and who pushed the button.
Yeah, the auto.
And so you're really, and people like me mess with it. I mean, I vote the wrong way just to mess with it. So you should know that any of the stuff like that is complete nonsense. But I'm with John. Candidate polling's the best because you have no reason. You don't want to skew it anyway. You want the clearest snapshot of time that you can get. And unfortunately, those candidates aren't going to give you those polls.
Questions?
Well,
Yes.
Mr. Ragtan,
Yes, ma'am.
tell me, your party, Mitt Romney, what did he mean by the 47%? He wants to be president, but what's going to happen to us, this other 47? And I thought to become the president is for everybody. And Todd Aiken talking about a legitimate race, and I've been trying to figure that out.
Well, I wish you well in your endeavor. One of the things about running for office is that I have the freedom to say, if I can say something really stupid today, and I may have done that once or twice on the radio, Michael, and I know you certainly have, and it has no account. I mean, so I said something stupid, what else is new? But when you're running for office, you've got to govern everything you say. And I think Mitt Romney, if he had it to do over again, would have not phrased that talk to those 30 donors, wherever it was, the way he did. I think what he was attempting to communicate was that there is a divide in this country, and some of it, one of the reasons that almost half of the folks in America don't pay taxes is because of the tax reform that the Republicans passed in the 1980s, and it was at that time was a good thing. You know, we're taking more people off the tax roll. But I think the point he was trying to make is that there is a chasm in the country between the people who are funding the government and the people who are benefiting from that. We all benefit in terms of defense and roads and so forth. But I think the point he was trying to make is that you go into an election, 45+% of the people are against you, and 45% of the plus people are for you, and you're not going to get that 45% of the people that's against you to vote for you most of the time. And the real fight is over that 5 or 6 points in the middle. And I think he was inarticulate in saying that, and I think it has caused the campaign to be off message for 48 hours. It's not the last stupid thing he's going to say before the election, and it's not the last stupid thing Barack Obama is going to say before the election, because people, you know, as your words increase, your folly increases at the same rate.
Yeah, but the real thing here, I mean, I think there's probably some truth to what Barack Obama or Mitt Romney explained in terms of his strategy, but it's never good when you make a statement and you're spending the next 2 days cleaning up after it. And we've seen Mitt Romney have to do that twice in the last 2 weeks. Once on his foreign policy and his thoughts as it related to the embassy situation, and now this more recent thing with the 47%. If you're running for president, you can't have many weeks like this. They're survivable, right? Barack Obama did it where he said people cling to their guns and their Bibles. What we've seen John Kerry, I voted for the war after I voted against it before I voted for it. We're starting to see some of that out of Mitt Romney, and it's not necessarily something he's going to want to have to continue to deal with. Right. And to have two of them happen so quickly, it really is an amateur hour. I didn't understand why he had the press conference and stated the stuff he did. I think he even exasperated his problem by hosting the press conference to try to fix it. And I would imagine there's got to be some cleaning up of the communication shop right now in the Romney campaign.
Yeah, I remember they had the earlier gaffe about the Etch-a-Sketch where his communications director went on the morning show, and that was a disaster. I mean, there are moments like that in a campaign. I do as a highly valued political consultant.
Highly.
I have a rule that I tell my clients that if you discover that you've stepped in a pile of doo-doo, and we all do occasionally because there's dogs running around. If you discover that you've stepped in a pile of doo-doo, by all means, try to avoid rolling around in it for the next several days. So that's just, it's just some free, friendly advice.
How did that go with Todd Aiken when he gave that advice?
Well,
I know, the Lord put the doo-doo there.
No.
We have another question? Yes.
I just, first of all, I love your show, and I hardly ever miss it. So
Oh.
I appreciate it.
Thank you.
But I was watching about a month ago on the Sunday morning shows when Mary Madeline told everybody that Todd Aiken was going to go away and Ian Wagner was going to replace her. And I just stood there and with my mouth open. What went on there? And why did she just proclaim that?
Can I give my thought first?
You go right ahead.
First of all, Mary Madeline, if you watch her on TV, she's the only person who talks who doesn't move her lips. So watch that next time. It'll annoy the heck out of you now that I pointed it out. She doesn't move her lips when she talks. I don't know that anything that we're seeing with Todd Aiken should be too much of a surprise to anybody that's from Missouri. And I think that a lot of what you heard out of the national folks and the full press, the full court press that we saw to get him out of the race probably would have worked on 99.9% of any of the other candidates out there. Those who don't know Todd Aiken would not realize that this would only embolden him. And I think that there was a very, very bad miscalculation on a national level that then had to spiral to a local level where you have Danforth and Bond and Ashcroft and everybody having to try to pull the same direction that Karl Rove and others had set. And I think it was a poor strategy.
You know what? You're absolutely right.
Thank you. Did you hear that? Marty down.
But, the thing that happened, I knew when I was watching, I was actually watching that Jaco thing live on Sunday morning. You'll remember that Jaco teased all weekend that Aiken said some controversial stuff about the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. That's what KTVI teased all weekend leading up to the Sunday morning program. And then when you actually look at the tape, what they represented that Todd Aiken said about the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act was wrong. That's not what he actually said. But be that as it may, I was tuned in, and I experienced the comment live, and I remember my wife and I looked at each other and we said, he just lost the election. And and that was our initial immediate reaction to the comment. And I think the response from Republicans is that folks that do campaigns for a living looked at that and came to the same conclusion. He just lost the election. And so the smart people in Washington decided that we got to get him out of there. And so they went into this strategy very quickly within really 24 hours. And I think the first one was Scott Brown in Massachusetts, and then Senator Johnson in Wisconsin, and then it sort of snowballed from there, this call to get out. And Michael's right. With most people that are professional politicians who do politics for a living, when they see that the money's getting pulled and your team is leaving the field, they say, okay, I get it, But that's not Todd. And it would have been a far better approach to quietly go to Todd with people he trusted and lay out for him and say, explain to me how you win now. This really, this is about something bigger than you. It's about the United States Senate. It's about the future of the country. And if you decide through your prayer and your consideration and looking at the facts, if you decide to stay in this, then we're with you. But really, really look at this, not from the standpoint of Todd Aiken, but from the standpoint of the United States Senate, from the standpoint of Obamacare. And if they would have had that conversation with Todd, I'm not saying that he would have gotten out at that point, but it absolutely would not have backed him into the corner that he was backed into. And now you got a situation where we've got a candidate for the U.S. Senate who has discovered that the way to raise money effectively is to run against the party bosses and the establishment, which is a great strategy in a primary election sometimes. But when you're running in a general election and your messaging coming out of your campaign is saying that the Republican Party is not with me and they're being awful to me, that is not an effective way to put a 51% electorate together. And I think fundamentally his problem is that he's raising money running against the establishment, and however much he's shaving off of his Republican vote there, maybe it's only 2 points, maybe it's more, it's very hard to win a general election when you're shaving off numbers.
Two other problems here is I think there are enough folks who are that far from his perspective and believe the way that he does that from around the country will send enough money into him to keep him viable in this in this race, and that becomes even more problematic because he will have enough money to be able to stay on TV and on the radio. Second other thing you got to remember is this man, the entire time he's run for office, has been told the same thing he's been hearing. You can't win. You'll never win. You're too far to the right. You're wrong on this. We thought we could win the congressional race once he was nominated in the Republican primary because we had a good moderate Democrat and Ted House. And he beat him. Everybody told him there's no way you can beat John Brunner in this campaign. You're on a suicide mission, and he won. I mean, so he's kind of used to being the underdog here, and he's got somebody on his side that a lot of us don't.
Yeah, that's the other thing. I think to assume that he's going. I mean, he just may win this thing, and wouldn't that be something?
It'd say a lot about Missouri.
It'd say a lot about Claire McCaskill.
There you go. Well, we did elect a dead man, so keep that in mind.
In your opinion, then, are you saying there's probably no chance that Todd Aiken would pull out?
No, he's not going to pull out.
I was going to ask then, who would you see being appointed?
It's an academic exercise.
Yeah.
If a candidate did withdraw, a statewide candidate did withdraw, the state committee would choose. That's
Right.
about 70 people who vote.
Yeah.
And I think you would have. I think Ann Wagner would be an option. I've heard Joanne Emerson expressed as an option, member of Congress, female. I think Sarah Steelman would be very interested in it, and I think John Bruner would be very interested in it, and I think they would make their case to the state committee, and I honestly don't know how that would come out, because it's a election. It's like running for student council at a very small high school.
Well, how could Ann Wagner how could Ann or Joanne, since they have congressional community?
Well, then they would create a vacancy in their congressional seats, and then a smaller group of people would then pick that replacement. And, you know, some would refer to them as party bosses.
Yeah, I'd like you guys to comment a little bit more on the governor race. So I recently moved down here from Illinois, and Quinn is very active governor from my perspective.
Yeah.
You're mentioning that Jay Nixon hasn't done much. All I know from the commercials is that he's balanced the budget. So I'm just kind of curious what your problems with Nixon are, and a little bit more about what the governor should be.
Sure, little known fact, Governor Boggs balanced the budget in the 1830s because the Constitution of Missouri requires that the budget be balanced. There has never not been a balanced budget with a governor in the history of the state of Missouri. And I mean, when that's almost, you know, gosh, that's almost like taking credit for paying your property tax at the end of the year. I mean, it's what you got to do, you know. So Nixon has, there's a tremendous history in Missouri of governors who do very little, doing very well at the polls.
I'm glad you're saying this for me.
And
Go ahead, you're right on.
yeah. But I do think if Spence can get this thing focused on the economy, he's going to need some help from the presidential race too in order to win. If they can get this thing focused on the economy and take get the voters to take a real honest look at our state compared to, you know, actually it doesn't help our side that we're right next to Illinois, because Illinois is a mess, man. I mean, goodness gracious. But many of the states surrounding us are thriving much better than Missouri is. And if the voters take an honest look at that and shine the light of Jay Nixon's record on Jay Nixon, I think we've got a shot at the governor's race. I think we're an underdog.
Yeah, I mean, I would argue that Jay Nixon is governing as a right of center governor. In fact, I think one of his biggest things that he has to deal with between now is motivating his base. They're not as enthusiastic about the governor as maybe they are about Senator McCaskill or Barack Obama, because he's kind of been there in the middle. You know, he's bailed the Republicans out of several problems, including the puppy mills. You know, the majority of the people here, we voted against getting rid of puppy mills, and the governor and the legislature overturned it, and the governor fixed that problem for him. Wound up finding compromise legislation. So he's, I think Jay Nixon's in such a position where he's done exactly what John said when he started, which is kind of just kept the ship going in the right direction, and Missouri likes that.
Compromise was they agreed to allow 2% of the puppies to vote, and seemed to get everybody on board.
Yeah, I know we're very, very worried about voter fraud here in the state of Missouri. It's not happened. We've not had voter fraud. In fact, we've had 85 cases of voter fraud in this country.
Where do you come up with this?
In the last 10 years.
Who's feeding you this?
Michael Bloomberg, Republican.
Oh,
85 cases of voter fraud in this country, yet 42,000 people this year alone will die from gun violence. There will not be one gun bill introduced in Jefferson City. There's what? How many voter fraud bills do you have introduced?
That's like apples and pomegranates.
Exactly. We're wasting time on an issue to keep people from being able to participate in the process. There are three things that you have to be able to do to vote in this state. You have to be 18, you have to be registered, and not convicted of a felony. Outside of that, you can be blind, you can be deaf, you can be dumb, you can be a Republican. You don't have to show up and show anything. Your vote's going to matter.
There's actually four. What are the three things again?
18, registered, and not convicted of a felony.
And you have to be you.
And you are you when you show up.
You can't, if you show up and you're not you when you're casting a vote, that is voter fraud. And the only thing that the ballot integrity legislation attempts to do is ensure that the people that are voting legally, properly, and once. And as long as, and the Republicans believe that everybody should participate in the process legally, properly, and once.
Right.
That's what we. I mean, you can argue with it, but that is the truth. Next question.
This is why they're so popular and they're so much fun. You had your hand up.
Yes, I'd like to hear both of you comment on the president's refusal or choice not to meet with Netanyahu, and whether there are political implications behind that regarding the upcoming election?
You know, U.S.-Israeli relations under this administration have been the most curious thing. One of the most curious things I've ever witnessed in American government. There is a sense, I think, in this administration, this is the least supportive of Israel administration that we've ever had in the United States. Now, you haven't seen it, much to my surprise, you haven't seen it reflected much when you look at polling data in terms of Jewish voters. They're still overwhelmingly voting for Barack Obama. But this is a president who has not been supportive of Israel to the extent that presidents in the past have been. And if you know, you can spin that any way you like, but the reality is when the Prime Minister of Israel feels that he is not being supported by his largest and in some cases only real ally, that's a huge problem. That's a huge problem for the Middle East region. It's a huge problem for American relations. It's a huge problem for America's presence in the Middle East. And the Middle East is a powder keg and a critical region for us. I think that it is entirely possible before we get to November the 7th? Mm-hmm. Before we get to November the 7th, we're already seeing the assaults on our embassies. But I think it's entirely possible that Israel and what's happening in Iran are going to be a much bigger voting factor by the time we get to November 7th than they are today. And I do not believe the president has managed the U.S.-Israeli relations very well, and that could cost him.
My only addition to that would be that if Netanyahu was hoping for that to get better than it is right now, I think his statements of last week probably keep that from happening. He's all in with Mitt Romney and chose to get involved in the American political process, and I'm not sure it's necessarily the smartest strategy for him, but I'm not an expert on this topic, so I'm not an expert on many.
Another question here.
Yeah, it seems like no matter who's been in the office up in D.C., the debt and the unfunded liabilities are just snowballing. Do you see this as something that can go on forever, or are we actually going to address this? Or I think right now it's, well, like in 2006 when times were good and everything was going great, I talked to the Fed people here and they were talking about 60 trillion of unfunded liabilities, which I think now turns out to be about 500,000 per taxpayer. And I hear numbers now anywhere between 120 to 220 trillion, which is a whole lot more. It seems like what's your view on this?
So this is where I think the president's compromise message is going to have to come out. And the reality is we're going to have to start cutting back on entitlements, and we're going to have to raise revenue, call it tax increases. And it's going to take people of strong will to do the right thing. But there's no way we can continue to go the way we're at. Now, I know you all want to believe, or a lot of people want to believe, that it all started in 2009. That's complete hogwash. This is a problem that's been with both parties for nearly 3 decades, and we're now at a point where we have a gun to the head and we have to fix it.
Yeah, I mean, your question is it going to be addressed? And the answer is yes. It's either going to be addressed proactively by our leaders or it's going to be addressed through circumstances. Because if we continue to run an economy where the government is borrowing all of the money and the credit markets are compromised, if we continue to run a government like that, then eventually we're going to have a massive chaotic collapse. And at that point, we'll address some things. I mean, that's what's happened in Greece. It's happening all over Europe. And there is no addressing America's spending without addressing entitlements. You can't do the math. So, you know, the 2013 is going to be an extremely critical year in American history, and we're going to go one of two ways. We're either going to start bailing out the boat, or we're going to sink.
So, and I liken it to, I'm Irish and I've been dealing with sun issues. So,
Because you play golf all the
so
time.
you have one theory that says just lube it up and that's how we'll fix this problem, is continue to do it. And then you have others that say let's burn it off and you'll be able to fix it. Well, we now have cancer. We're gonna have to go for chemo, and it's gonna take all of the above. I think that's the reality. We're gonna see entitlements cut, and we're gonna have to find more revenue some way. I know you hate hearing that.
I do.
Yeah. Isn't that in and of itself a powder keg? I mean, how are you going to deal with entitlements without developing a contingency or a constituency that's going to be very angry and maybe even revolutionary?
Well,
You're gonna make somebody mad.
well, yeah.
Not mad, you're going to make them
Yeah.
Furious.
Yeah, I think the key on entitlement reform is you cannot reform entitlements for people that are at or near the age of beneficiaries. I think because once you do, you ask Dan Rostenkowski how that worked out. Once you do that, politically you're done. But the reforms that have been proposed by Paul Ryan, and I'm not saying that the Ryan approach is the only approach or the best approach, but what's right about it is that it holds in place for people at or near retirement the program as it exists that they have planned for, and it reforms it and changes it and introduces some market principles in it for younger people. And the problem with that approach politically is that it gets demagogued that to get these at or near retirement people concerned. And you're not going to potentially have that problem in 2013 because there's no election looming. And I think if you look at a generational reform of both Medicare and Social Security that fundamentally changes the program for younger people and introduces more choice and more market competition and more freedom for the individual, I think you've got a chance to reform those programs.
But aren't those two just a tip of an iceberg?
What do you
I
mean?
mean, when you're talking about entitlements, when you're talking about the federal debt, you're talking about unfunded liabilities. I mean, you've got such an amount that's below the water that is never discussed.
Well, you're getting real ice when you're dealing with Medicare and Social Security. I mean, you're dealing, that's everything else as far as freezing non-defense discretionary spending or cutting back defense spending. I would concur with you that is iceberg tip stuff. But I would say that Medicare and Social Security, in terms of both the existing debt issue and the unfunded liability issue, I think that's real ice. I mean, that's a substantial part of the government debt situation right now. It's not all of it, but it's substantial.
We've got time for one more quick question.
I too am a newcomer, so maybe I'm missing something, but my impression is that Spence is at AWOL. Is that wrong? I mean, at least in the advertising front, I don't see it.
Well, I think that may be part of his hurdle is having the funding to be able to compete against the governor. But in fairness to Mr. Spence, he is out there. I mean, I run into him on the campaign trail all the time. Unfortunately, we're in a situation where money equals speech, and I'm not sure he has enough speech.
Yeah, I mean, his biggest donor has been very supportive, and himself. And, you know, I think it's a situation where, and I ran into this, you know, we don't have a lot of experience in Missouri with self-funding candidates. There just really isn't a whole lot of experience with it like there is in other places. I know with John Bruner, we had a plan going in that we were going to raise money and then John was going to finance the bulk of the campaign, but it ended up where raising the money was just extremely difficult, and it's even harder for a guy that can write a check because the donors aren't as inclined to want to support somebody like that. And I think Dave Spence is seeing some of that problem too. In Bruner's case, he said, I will spend X in the primary. We budgeted that, and then at Bruner's own direction, he exceeded that. And I think Spence is in a similar circumstance where he has allocated, okay, I will put this much money into my campaign, and I don't know what the number is for him. I will put this much money in my campaign. I think he's finding fundraising challenging, and I think he's trying to stick to a campaign budget that at least looks like is substantially smaller than Jay Nixon's campaign budget. And so Nixon's had about 3 weeks of unanswered media up. Spence just started a new round of ads that came up yesterday. It's a very good ad if you haven't seen it, comparing Nixon to Obama. And I suspect that Spence will be on the air now for the balance of the campaign, and they'll slug it out.
And he's fighting an uphill battle, and then a lot of the base constituencies for money, typically for a Republican governor, are supportive of Governor Nixon. I mean, a lot of the big businesses in St. Louis and Kansas City.
Some of the ag groups.
And a lot of the ag groups are supportive of Governor Nixon. So it puts even more money in Nixon's coffers over traditionally liberal side unions, trial lawyer type money. Now you throw in business and other money that's non-traditional. It makes that cup that he has to fill all the bigger.
One of the most disturbing, I'll just say this in closing, just politically, one of the most disturbing things I have noted in this election cycle, we're going to be outspent. I don't know about the presidential race. The Republicans are going to be outspent in the U.S. Senate race. We're going to be outspent in the governor's race, lieutenant governor's race, Secretary of State's race, Attorney General's race, Treasurer's race. The Democrat Treasurer, Clinton Zweifel, who was a student of mine years ago.
Yes.
The Democrat Treasurer, Clinton Zweifel, has more cash on hand than Peter Kinder, Shane Scholler, Ed Martin, and Cole McNary combined. That's troubling in terms of the election outcome.
So before we wrap up, can I share one thing?
Absolutely.
Because I think it falls in line with the think tank and that you're for freedom and free market. There is something that's going on in the state of Missouri that I think is undemocratic, and it's wrong, and I think it fits in line with what you all are fighting, and that's term limits. I think the term limits that we have imposed in the city, in Jefferson City, are counterproductive to democracy. And I know they were brought by the right, and I think they're now realizing that this wasn't the best thing. I think a lot of the things that term limits were put in to fix have actually increased the problems that we faced. And it's a tough subject. It's not a popular topic with most voters, but term limits is absolutely killing us in Jefferson City. And I'm hopeful that groups like this will stand up and start to continue to have that conversation. Do we agree on this?
Yeah, I used to be ardently pro term limit. I remember I was in the legislature. We had old George from St. Charles, who'd been there for 30 years. And every year on Thursday you do what they call the consent calendar. It's the non-controversial legislation. You vote on about 35, 40 bills on a Thursday night. Well, old George liked to drink. So he figured out a way to rig his button. You vote, you press the button, and the board lights up. George figured out a way to get a paperclip stuck into his yes button, so he'd go out drinking on the consent calendar night. And so the bill would come up, and old George was the first vote to come up on the board every night. And so we finally saw that George was nowhere to be found, and somebody saw the paperclip over there, and so we offered an amendment making a dirty sock the official something of Missouri, and George voted for it. But anyway, and for me that was always the rationale of why we got to have term limits, and because you got a lot of really dead weight in the Missouri General Assembly. But I think the net effect of it has not been helpful for the proper function of the government. The legislative branch of government in this system is vitally important. It contains checks and balances within itself, and we have weakened the legislative branch of government through term limits, and I believe that from a structure of government standpoint, that's not been a good thing. That's my opinion.
Thank you both very much. Round of applause, please.